Here's myself. I'm Sheriff Bart May of the Clark County Sheriff's Office. I want to kind of introduce everybody that's helped us with this project. We're here today to release the name of the victim of the John Doe that was found in the cave back in 1979 and 1991. First off, here to my left, I have Dr. Margaret Press. She's the co-executive director and co-founder of the DNA Project. Then I have Dr. Samantha Platt, who is the assistant professor. Did I say that right? Platt?
No, Platt.
Platt?
Yeah.
Dr. Samantha Platt, who is the assistant. Did I say it?
That's all right.
Still wrong. Go ahead and say it for me.
Bees. Blatt.
Blatt.
Yes.
Okay. She's the assistant professor and anthropologist at ISU. Then I have Anthony Redgrave. He's the case manager and team leader for the Clark County DNA Doe case under the DNA Project. Deputy John Clements, he's my chief deputy. He is the investigating officer that I assigned this case to, that pulled all these people together and was able to actually come up with a name. John's done a lot of work on this. I appreciate everything that he's done. To my right over here, I have our Clark County coroner, Brenda Laird. I have Florence Dickens. And you got your dog up here? And Caven is the dog. He is a cadaver dog. And they're with Semper Vigilance. And then I have Tanner Solowski. Oh, I skipped one. Dr. Amy.
There's Tanner over there.
So Tanner Solowski. He's a forensic genealogy volunteer with the DNA Doe Project. And I have Dr. Amy Michael, who's the anthropology professor at the University of New Hampshire. All these guys, I actually have two out here in the audience that I have too. I have Dr. Christian Peterson, who's an anthropologist, department at ISU. If you'd stand up, please. And then I have Dr. Sarah Getz, who's also with the anthropology department at ISU. All these people have been instrumental in helping us to come up with the name of this John Doe that we've had in this cave. And not only have they been instrumental in it, but it kind of, by having the name, is able to put a pretty good story together as to the life of this individual. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the time over to the people that did all the work and let them kind of tell you their stories and how that we got to this process, and reveal the name as to who our body is, the remains belong to. Who wanted to go first?
I think Margaret's going to.
Margaret?
No, I'm going to introduce you.
What? You're going to introduce Anthony?
Okay, so Sam. I'll go first.
All right, we'll let Sam go first.
I'm Dr. Samantha Blatt. Oh yeah, turn it on. Dr. Samantha Blatt, Anthropology Department at Idaho State University. And I'm going to split this presentation, which is going to be very brief because we want you to get to the exciting part, with Dr. Amy Michael, who is formerly of ISU, and that's how she became involved. So I'm going to give you a very abbreviated history, specifically leading to ISU's involvement, and then we'll talk a little bit about analysis of the skeletal remains, and then lead into Anthony. So. As many of you probably know, in August 26th of 1979, Sheriff Earl Holden was called in to the Buffalo Cave of the defense caves, the civil defense caves. A family found remains of a torso in a burlap sack, and they recovered that with deputies from Clark County. And they went in through with a metal detector. Nothing else was found at that time. The coroner at that time believed that the remains were only there for about 10 years or even shorter, but it wasn't known at that time. However, Sheriff Holden said that, oh no, this looks like a gambler from 60 years ago. So it was already at the beginning, no one could identify who this person was. So once we get to ISU, really ISU's involvement began in 1991 when the limbs were found by an 11-year-old girl in the same cave, specifically hands in a burlap sack sticking through the sediment of the cave. There was an excavation done by the Idaho Museum of Natural History and ISU at that period. Then in 1997, specifically, the remains were transferred to the Department of Anthropology to Terry Hall, and it has been in anthropology hands ever since then, and has been studied by numerous anthropologists and students from that point. From 1997 to 2007, Florence Dickens, as a student, wrote a report about the skeletal remains. Later, in 2008 or 2009, 2010, she went back to the cave with 2 of her dogs to search for any further remains, which Amy will talk a little bit about why we were there. And then 2015, a professor at ISU at the time, Kara Stull, along with Christian Peterson, did an excavation at the cave. Again, a very systematic excavation, didn't find anything further. And then at that time, also Nick Holmer at ISU did a scan of the cave system as well. So now I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Amy Michael to talk about the specifics of the skeleton.
So many anthropologists and students have taken a run at this case trying to figure out who this man was, and as anthropologists, we're interested in a number of things at the outset if we don't know who the person is. So we're interested in estimating the age of the individual, the sex, the ancestry, the race, and the stature, how tall the person was. And so in 1979, Doug Ubelacher of the Smithsonian, in coordination with the FBI, he begins to do an initial report and analysis. And he says, much like everybody else, I'm not really sure about the post-mortem interval, don't know exactly how long this individual has been deceased. And he estimates 6 months to 10 years. So here we have the coroner disagree, the original coroner disagreeing, and the original sheriff's disagreeing, and then the anthropologist disagreeing. So a big mystery. In 2017, Dr. Kate Reedy from Idaho State, the department chair at Idaho State of the anthropology department, she submits a bone sample from the femur for DNA analysis. And this is entered into CODIS, NDIS, and the NamUs profile is updated on this individual, but still no identification, right? So I began to think in 2017, man, there's no, identification of this individual, and maybe the DNA Doe Project might be interested in this case. So I worked with Dr. Samantha Blatt and a few other folks. We kind of redid the biological profile, the age, sex, stature, and ancestry as best that we could. We asked John Clements for permission to submit to the DNA Doe Project, and luckily they decided to accept the case. So the post-mortem interval, or how long the individual had been dead, this is what we knew as we were submitting to the DNA Doe Project. The post-mortem interval, unknown, right? Lots of discrepancy there. Sex, we knew this was a biological male, right? We had good evidence for that. Our age estimate, we said he was probably between 25 and 45 years old at the time of his death. The hair, there was some mummified tissue, so there was still some hair left. It was reddish brown. We did the best we could in terms of his ancestry, but you'll see in a second why that was difficult. But we measured the postcrania, or everything below the head, and 94.9, I can't see too far, 94.9% probability that this individual was an individual of European ancestry. And stature estimation is a little off. Again, I'll show you why in a second. But estimate between 5'5" and 6'1" during life. And here's why the bioprofile is a little complicated. At the time of recovery, remember the man is recovered in parts, right? 1979, first recovery, 1991, second recovery. That's because he was dismembered after death, likely after death, using multiple methods and tools. So we have evidence for that on the skeleton. So no pictures of the bones in this presentation, but these red lines indicate the marks of dismemberment, or likely marks of dismemberment. and the limbs were in the burlap sack, right? So probably for expedient transfer of the body to the hiding place or the clandestine burial in the cave. Sharp and blunt force trauma both evident on the long bones. Sharp force trauma probably evident on the 5th, possibly 6th cervical vertebra, but no cause of death that we could see, right? This is probably a post-mortem circumstance that this happened. So we don't know how he died, right? But we're confident that this is a homicide. So as anthropologists working on cold cases, right, we are really interested in identifying the victim. That's our first priority, and second is, of course, to return the remains to the family. So after all these multiple analyses and 40 years, right, give or take, of work on the identification of the decedent, still no new clues. So we reached out to the DNA Doe Project. March 2019 is when we first made contact with them. Dr. Margaret Press here and Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, the other co-director, and they agreed to take the case, and they were excited about it, and so that made us even more excited. And they had such great luck with resolving identities before that we felt really confident, even though we had no head, right? That we were maybe going to get an identification. And Clark County Sheriff's Office allowed us to do this, so thanks to them for being open to this as well. And May through July, we submitted a DNA sample to DNA Solutions that was sequenced by a company called Othram. Forensic genealogists have been hard at work on this, and Anthony will give you kind of a better timeline of that. So our acknowledgements are in alphabetical order. Everyone has been, there's no way to possibly list the number of people involved in this case. We think it would be really cool to try to generate a master list of everyone who's had anything to do with it, but the list is very long. It's 40 years worth of work from different forensic specialists, law enforcement, students, etc. But a special call out to these folks in particular. A lot of them are students, anthropologists, and various archaeologists who have kind of passed through Idaho State. So that is the anthropology part, and I'm going to turn this over then to Anthony Redgrave to talk about the DNA and the identification. Margaret, just kidding.
Say me. Oh, I don't have any slides.
Oh, okay. You do.
I'm Anthony. Hi, I'm Dr. Margaret Press, and in 2017, I co-founded the DNA Doe Project with Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick with the mission to try and help identify John and Jane Does around the country using genetic genealogy techniques that have been so successful finding biological parents for adoptees. So over the past 2 years now, we've had over 24 success stories and have been succeeding beyond our wildest dreams. A lot of the reasons for this success have to do with the sheer numbers of people who have taken direct-to-consumer tests. Recently, there's probably about 30 million of them now in the various databases, and some of that is filtered down to the databases we have access to. But people who have uploaded to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA and opted in, that's the critical part right now, have enabled us with a smaller set of tests available to pursue these identifications. The other reasons for our success have been the incredible labs and scientists that we've been working with, and there's just a long list, but in this particular case, Dr. Kate Reedy and Dr. Samantha Blatt of the Department of Anthropology here at Idaho State University, Dr. Amy Michael, of course, of University of New Hampshire, Department of Anthropology. Othram, as was mentioned, did our sequencing. Full Genomes Corporation Incorporated and Dr. Gregory Magoon at Aerodyne Research did the bioinformatics, and DNA Solutions did the extraction for us. The other reasons are the cooperation and availability of these databases to begin with. Without GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA now, we would not be able to do any of this work. Then the generosity of our many, many donors. We raise the funds for all the testing fees, which are not cheap. In particular, the Dyer Family Foundation enabled us to complete the fundraising. But lastly, the hard work and the passion and the dedication of all of our volunteer genetic genealogists who put in hundreds and thousands of hours on these cases. So we do thank the Clark County, Idaho Sheriff Bart May and Deputy Clemens for entrusting us with this phenomenal case. It was extraordinary, but luckily the team working on him was extraordinary as well. And with that, I'd like to introduce to you Anthony Redgrave, the team leader, who's about to tell you an incredible story.
Hello. Hello. Hi, my name is Anthony Redgrave. I'm the team leader for the Clark County John Doe case at the DNA Doe Project. With the combined efforts of 14 other volunteer forensic genealogists, we took about 15 weeks and more than 2,000 hours of research combined to come to our conclusion. There were approximately 250 different DNA matches. I mean, there were actually several thousand total who were in the databases that matched this John Doe at some level, but of those we worked on about 250 of those individuals to figure out their family trees, to build out their pedigrees in order to make this identification. And these matches and their ancestors and their relatives ended up totaling about 31,730 individual people in the combined trees that we worked on to research and find this identification. So to continue the timeline that Dr. Michael and Dr. Blatt began, we received permission to work on this identification, and then Idaho State University shipped a tibia to DNA Solutions for extraction. This process yielded about 72.26 nanograms of extract, which was then sent to Othram Inc. for extraction, for sequencing. Now, that number may seem a little arbitrary, but 72.26 nanograms is actually a lot for us to work with, which really surprised us given the conditions of the cave and everything. He was actually really well preserved. It was kind of amazing. When this was completed, the digitized full genome sequence was sent to Dr. Gregory Magoon, Senior Research Engineer at Aerodyne Research, working in collaboration with Full Genomes Corporation. Dr. Magoon rendered the full genome sequence into a file suitable for GEDmatch, and that file was uploaded and processed into GEDmatch's database. It took about 2 days to fully process, and then the team at the DNA Doe Project was able to start working on building out all of the family trees of all of this John Doe's DNA cousins. And somewhere around October 28th was when we started coming to our conclusion. Given the difficulty of determining a post-mortem interval, as Drs. Michael and Blatt had explained, we took a lot of extra effort to confirm our potential identity over the course of several days. And on November 5th, the DNA Doe Project submitted the preliminary report presenting this candidate for identification to the Clark County Sheriff's Office. And then they took that information that we gave them and contacted a living grandson of the candidate and hand-delivered a direct-to-consumer DNA test. So, like, direct-to-consumer means something that any person can buy, like an Ancestry test or Family Tree DNA or 23andMe. They hand-delivered a test to him because there was no way that there was no living sibling or full sibling or child to test that would produce a CODIS hit, so we had to do it that way. When the results came back, we were able to confirm our John Doe's identity via direct one-to-one comparison. And here comes the part you've been waiting for. Through our research, following the tireless efforts of innumerable experts, we have identified Clark County John Doe. His name was Joseph Henry Lovelace. We were unable to find a photo of Joseph Henry Lovelace, so a composite image was created from photos of his close relatives and physical descriptions we found in documents. This is in no way intended to be an exact likeness, but it is provided here for illustrative purposes. Joseph Henry Lovelace was born December 3rd in 1870 in Payson, Utah Territory. to Joseph Jackson Lovelace of Indiana and Sarah Jane Scriggins of Massachusetts. They both came to Utah as early pioneers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Of the 250 DNA matches that we researched along the way, there were some that were particularly high matches. Shown here are 4 autosomal matches, 2 related to Lovelace through his mother's family and 2 related through his father's family, the grandchild that we used for confirmation, and a Y DNA match that led us to the Lovelace surname. What's unique about this case is that in all 4 of the autosomal matches, are first cousins 3 times removed. What this means is a removal in a cousin relationship describes how many generations there are between the 2 cousins and their common ancestor, how many generations difference there are. So in this case, Lovelace's grandparents are the 3rd great-grandparents of all of those matches. So there's 3 generations in between there. This leads us to some of the other unique challenges of this case. Descendants of pioneers who have done their family history will know that their ancestors had many, many children, often with several different spouses during the time period in which polygamy was practiced. This results in endogamy, which is the practice of intermarriage between a small group of related people. This is common to religious communities and also geographically isolated communities, which both of these were at the time, which results in the DNA looking different than it would in ways you could predict. And also, this also leads to half relationships, meaning that there would be half cousins because they were only related through one parent of a couple. Both of these factors affect the way that DNA looks when it's inherited to other people. With endogamy, people tend to share higher, and with half relationships, they share lower. So it was very unpredictable. So even though we had close matches, it was a little difficult to work with and figure out how it all fit in the big picture. The broad post-mortem interval, due to the remarkably preservative conditions of the cave, and the broad age estimate, due to the conditions of the remains, gave us an incredibly broad range of potential birth and death dates to look at for an ideal candidate. We ended up having several candidates that fit the bill, and there was a lot of detail work and creative thinking that went into signaling out Joseph Henry Lovelace as our man. Henry also had several aliases, including Walter or Walt Cairns and various related variations, and Charles Smith. It was a tremendous team effort to prove that all of these names belonged to the same individual. Later, this was confirmed by records from the sheriff's office. Henry was also an outlaw. He had very little in the way of a legal paper trail, so most of his timeline to show proof of life activity was built out from newspaper articles about his various exploits under his several aliases. At the time of his death, he had no permanent address and was living in a tent on the outskirts of town. As far as the genetic detail work that went into our conclusion, Dr. Gregory Magoon located Y DNA markers in the full genome sequence that pointed us to the surname Lovelace. Our volunteer genealogist, Mark Houlihan, who has a great deal of experience working with Y DNA, traced John Doe's Y markers to a specific patrilineal ancestor. Meanwhile, building the tree of genetic cousins of a genetic cousin who matched on John Doe's X chromosome and therefore was related to him on his maternal side. Looking at my notes. We found a pair of people who both descended from that Y line and that X line who married and had children. And then it was just a matter of figuring out which of those children would have met an unfortunate end in the Buffalo Cave. Henry wasn't a candidate at first because he has a headstone already placed at a family plot in Payson City Cemetery in Utah. Further investigation revealed that that headstone had no death date carved on it, and the cemetery was contacted and there was no record of any interment in that plot. Furthermore, there are some family stories that had been circulating regarding the manner of Henry's death, and they were disproven by our team via original records and newspaper articles. Confirmation through conventional means such as dental, fingerprint, or CODIS wasn't going to work in this case. CODIS can only produce a reliable hit in comparison to a parent, child, or full sibling. There aren't enough markers that are tested to even compare a half-sibling or a grandchild. And all of Henry's relationships at this level were already long gone. Deputy John Clements personally delivered a direct-to-consumer test to the living grandson, and that was how we were able to compare to our kit on GEDmatch. As I said previously, Henry was an outlaw. He was born in 1870 in Payson, Utah. In 1899, at age 28, he married Harriet Jane Hattie Savage in Salt Lake City. By 1904, they were divorced. Hattie had filed for divorce on grounds of desertion and failure to provide for her and their one daughter. Based on newspaper reports of their court proceedings, it doesn't look like he showed up to court when he was summoned either. In August of 1905, Henry was in Idaho, and he married Agnes Octavia Caldwell. Between 1906 and 1913, they had 4 children. In March and December of 1914, Henry was arrested for bootlegging. This was during a time before the federal prohibition went into effect. So at this time, Fremont County, from which Clark County was split in 1919, was a dry county under the local option law. In December, Henry made one of his many escapes by sawing through the jail bars. In March of 1916, a man referred to as Walter Guerin escaped from prison by sawing through the bars of his cell after somehow stopping a train to escape from it. The news article is strangely worded, but we assume that he was being transported to jail on a train and somehow stopped the train in an attempt to escape it. He was somehow caught and put in prison and then escaped again anyway. On May 5th of 1916, Henry's wife, Agnes Caldwell Lovelace, was murdered by an axe by a man called Charles Smith, who is described in some reports as her husband. At least 2 of their children were present at the time of their murder. The whereabouts of Henry Lovelace are unknown at this time. This is when we started to wonder if Henry was using an alias. On May 11th, Agnes's murderer is arrested under the name Walter Currens, who is also known by the alias Smith. He's arrested for the murder of his common-law wife, who was also a suspected bootlegger and used the alias Ada Smith. And then, on May 18th, Walter Currens escaped from jail by sawing through the bars, using a saw he hid in his shoe. At Agnes's funeral, one of Agnes and Henry's children was quoted as saying, "Papa never stayed in jail very long, but he'll soon be out." As we piece these stories together, the reports clearly suggested that Walter Currens, Charles Smith, and Joseph Henry Lovelace were all the same person, and that Agnes Lovelace was murdered by her husband. This was later confirmed by the Clark County Sheriff's Office via police records. Agnes Octavia Caldwell Lovelace was born in 1880 in Malad City, Idaho. She died May 5th, 1916, at the hands of her husband, Joseph Henry Lovelace, who not long after met a similar end. This is an example of one of the many news articles that we used to build Henry's timeline. In this article from the Idaho Republican, dated May 19th, 1916, you can see that Henry, using the name Walter Currens, told police that he believed that Agnes's former husband had killed her. Agnes did have a former husband before Henry, but he was living in another state with a new family at the time of her death. Joseph Henry Lovelace had no such alibi, and Agnes was never married to or associated with anyone by the name Walter Currens or Charles Smith. The former husband that Walter is referring to is himself. The wanted poster describing Walt Currens and his crime includes a physical description that matches some of the characteristics of Joseph Henry Lovelace's immediate family members. His father had very light eyebrows, if any, and his parents and siblings had light-colored eyes with a dark ring that may be what is implied by bluish-brown. Most notably from the wanted poster is the clothing description. The wanted man is described as wearing a red sweater with blue overalls over black trousers. The remains of Clark County John Doe were found wearing dark-colored pants, a white shirt with blue pinstripes, and a maroon sweater, which unmistakably matches what Henry was wearing when he escaped prison. Henry Lovelace, under the assumed name Walt Cairns, escaped in May of 1916. The remains found in the cave in 1979 had those same clothing. This means that in all likelihood, Henry had been murdered and transported to the cave not long after his escape, making his post-mortem interval, the time between his death and the discovery of his body, as long as 63 years. This case has been historic in more than one meaning of the word. And if you'd like to know more about any other John and Jane Does that the DNA Doe Project is working to identify, you can visit our website or social media. Additionally, none of this would be possible without the assistance of people like you. If you've ever taken a DNA test and you can still access it, if you can get into the login, or if you were given a test for Christmas, I know some of you might have gotten some for Christmas time, you can find instructions on how to get your raw data and upload it to both Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch and opt into law enforcement matching at our website at help.forensicgenealogytraining.org. Additionally, if you are involved in law enforcement and would like to learn how to do this to solve your own agency's cold cases, you can go to forensicgenealogytraining.org and sign up for our training course, which has a couple of different options available. I think that's it for my part of the presentation. I think that we can open up for questions if anyone has any. Yeah?
I would kind of like to know from the anthropological side, after this information was uncovered, does it connect some dots for you that maybe you were having trouble when you were looking at the remains?
Particularly, yes, with the post-mortem interval. I mean, that was a huge mystery.
Yeah.
And it also shows that, we don't know as much as we would like to know. And we need to do more to figure that out, because this definitely threw most anthropologists, all anthropologists that looked at this. Yeah.
I think with the age estimate too, Anthony's team kept asking us, do you think he could be 35 to 50? Could he be 40 to 50? And we just couldn't know. And there were some signs on the bones that made us think that, maybe he was on the older end of that age profile. But at the same time, he might have been a laborer, he might have been a hard drinker. We don't know all these things, all these lifestyle variables that can go into making the bones look a little older than the chronological age. So all of this work really kind of allows us to backtrack and look at the case with through a finer lens as well, and learn some things ourselves. We've learned a lot parallel to this investigation.
So do we know who did him in?
We're still actively working that.
So on the sheriff's office side of this, we have the name and identity of the remains. The story pretty much tells itself. The case will continually stay opened because we do not know who murdered him or how he was actually murdered. As the case officer in my office was working this case, they came back with the name of Henry B. Lovelace. My chief deputy came to me and said, wow, Bonnie Stoddard, who's here in the crowd today, she actually told me that she thought the subject in the cave was Henry B. Lovelace. So Deputy Clements looked into it. Bonnie has wrote this book right here on page 295. I don't have it on this.
295, 296.
Yeah, on page 295, she actually has an article written in this book about the murder of Agnes and about how she was killed and how Mr. Lovelace was arrested and placed into the St. Anthony jail and that he escaped out of there. She also has on page 319, she has a whole article that talks about the remains and when we brought people up into the cave and the investigation as to doing the archaeological digs and everything. which is why I put this book up here, because this book really helped tie in a bunch of the stuff. So once we had the name and we confirmed with the stories in this book, we turned around and we contacted Fremont County Sheriff's Office because we wanted to see if they actually still had the arrest records on Henry Lovelace back in 1916. And it just so happened that as county agencies, we are busy scanning everything over onto microfiche to all our old paper records. And when we called over there, the clerk there said, "Holy cow, I just scanned that 2 days ago." So she was able to get that immediately for us and give us copies of that, which helped tie that in. I also want to make it known that the grandson that I sent Deputy Clements to go do the contact with is 87 years old. So we're looking at a timeline where this had, if these fine folks that are sitting here beside me hadn't done such a wonderful job that they had today, another 10, 20 years in that, we might not have been able to have that 100% positive match of DNA. So as the sheriff of Clark County, there's been many sheriffs that work this case. I just am elated that it happened to come about during my last of my terms. But I want these people to know how much I appreciate each and every one of them and all the hard work that they put in. They haven't charged us a dime for all their work that they've done. And that takes a huge thank you, especially for a county like ours. You know, you look back, we became Clark County in 1919, which is 1,764 square miles that Clark County takes in. Prior to that, we were part of Fremont County, which is the reason why he was taken to the St. Anthony jail. But quite a story. The book here has quite a bit of the history in it, which is absolutely amazing. And I just want to thank everybody for all the work that they've done. And any other questions you have?
Do you know the grandson's name? And does he live in Basin?
Yes, we know the grandsons' names. One grandson didn't want to talk with us and did not want to present any type of DNA sample. The other one is a very great guy, willing to meet with us and willing to do everything. No, they do not live in Payson.
They don't.
No, but I can tell you, without their help, we probably wouldn't be here today. So I sure appreciate that family and all that they've done for us too. Any other questions? Okay.
I think everybody deserves a hand.
I can tell you, and I just want to make one thing known that, you know, we're looking at a homicide that probably happened 103 years ago. And even though it happened 103 years ago, we're still working it today. We weren't just letting it rest. We're still trying to see what would come about it. I know sheriffs before me, they had officers that were working it and looking into it. When I became sheriff and Deputy Clements was here, I gave it to Deputy Clements. I didn't think that we'd come to this part. I always hoped that we would, but he did a phenomenal job working it. I think he needs the praise for what he did and all these guys for what they did. But it just definitely goes to show you that even though 103 years ago, 40 years ago to when the first part was found, we never stop working it. There may be days that go by that nothing happens, but we're always looking into it and seeing what new technology will bring. And these young ladies and gentlemen here have definitely showed us what technology does. And I thank them and appreciate them for every bit of it.
Bart,
Is the family going to get his remains, or are they going to stay in ISU?
Yes, the family will end up with the remains, and the remains can now be placed to rest. The problem is you know, the family is a little bit embarrassed by it over the deal, and it's to be expected. But at the same time, they understand there is an obligation. Money is tight. They found out that their grandfather has killed their grandmother, and they really don't know how much they want to do. But I think that they are asking for some type of donations or help to help pay for a proper burial for him. But they are working on it. I do know that.